All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're breaking down a huge shift in U.S. trade policy that is absolutely reshaping the global economy. And it all boils down to one single number. Here it is, 18.6%. This one number is at the heart of everything we're talking about today. As of right now, August 2025, that is the average tariff the U.S. is charging on goods coming into the country. And to give you some perspective, a rate this high is something we haven't seen in almost 100 years.
And look, this isn't just kind of high, it's historic. To find an average U.S. tariff rate this high, you have to go all the way back to the 1930s. Yes, the Great Depression. That's the scale of the change we're looking at.
So, to really get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. We'll start with the new playbook itself, then hit the global flashpoints, zoom in on the specific products getting targeted, check out the price we're paying at home, and finally, look at the very uncertain road ahead. All right, first up, the new tariff playbook. And really, this isn't about small tweaks here and there. We're talking about a fundamental, ground-up change in how America engages with the rest of the world on trade. The strategy kicks off with a new set of baseline tariffs, kind of like a starting point. There's a 10% tariff on most goods, it jumps to 25% for automobiles, and then a really steep 50% for key metals like steel, aluminum, and copper. But here's the real game changer. These tariffs can be stacked. So think of it like this. A product could get hit with that 10% base plus another tax on top of it for a completely different reason. And that's where things get really complicated. Okay, so how is this new playbook actually landing around the world? Well, that brings us right to our second part, the global trade flashpoints. And as you can probably guess, it's creating some serious friction. First, let's look at the biggest one, China. For the last 90 days, there's been a pause on new tariff hikes, kind of like a ceasefire. But here's the thing, that pause is set to expire this Tuesday. The clock is literally ticking. Now, there are talks about a possible extension, but nobody knows for sure. The whole situation is incredibly tense. And it's not just China. Look at the reaction from India. They got hit with a new surcharge, mostly because of their imports of Russian oil. And their government did not mince words, publicly calling the U.S. policy selective and unfair. And this table really shows you how tailored this strategy is. For China, you've got that 10% base rate plus a 20% tax stacked on top that's linked to fentanyl. For India, it's a different story, a 50% total rate, driven by their oil relationship with Russia. The result? A tense standoff with China and so much friction with India that it could actually delay major U.S. defense deals. Real-world consequences. Okay, so that's China and India. But what about our next-door neighbors? Canada and Mexico. Are they getting hit just as hard? Well, the answer there is it's a little more complicated. So yes, a 25% tariff was introduced for Canadian and Mexican imports. But, and this is a huge but, the USMCA, the big trade deal between the US, Mexico, and Canada, acts like this massive shield. Because of that agreement, a full 85% of all the trade between our 3 countries is totally exempt from these tariffs. It protects the vast majority of stuff flowing across the border. Now, this policy isn't just about targeting whole countries. It also gets super specific, aiming at individual, high-stakes products. And this is where we see some of the most dramatic moves. Let me just throw a question out there to set this up. Imagine what would happen if the cost of the microchips, the brains inside your phone, your car, your computer, what if their cost doubled? Literally overnight, because that is basically what's on the table. The administration has rolled out a jaw-dropping 100% tariff on imported semiconductors and the gear used to make them. This is, without a doubt, the single most aggressive piece of this entire strategy. But there's a really important catch here. That 100% tariff, it only hits finished chips that are imported into the U.S. It specifically does not apply to companies like TSMC, for example, who are right now building massive new chip factories inside the United States. The goal couldn't be clearer. It's a stick and a carrot. Make it brutally expensive to import chips, but make it really, really attractive to build them right here at home. And this isn't just about huge industrial scale stuff. This is going to affect pretty much anyone who buys things online. See, up until August 28th, there was this rule that let any package worth less than $800 come into the US completely tariff-free. Well, starting August 29th, that's over. That exemption is gone, which means all those little packages from overseas are now going to have tariffs applied, hitting online shoppers and tons of small businesses. So we've gone from giant semiconductors to tiny online orders. What does all of this add up to? Let's talk about the price at home, what this means for your wallet, and for the U.S. economy as a whole. Okay, so what's the bottom line for the average person? Well, analysts have run the numbers, and they estimate it comes out to roughly $2,400 in extra costs per U.S. household per year. And that cost shows up as higher prices on pretty much everything, from clothes and cars to even fresh fruits and vegetables.
Economically, this policy is like a two-step, pulling in two opposite directions at once. On one side, you have this huge surge in government revenue. We're talking over $150 billion this year alone. But on the other side, all this is expected to add almost 2/3 of a percentage point to core inflation. So that's the fundamental trade-off, right? A massive payday for the government that also puts real pressure on prices.
And that brings us to our last and maybe most critical piece of this whole story, the very uncertain road ahead. Because this strategy isn't just being argued about in terms of economics, it's actually being fought over in court. There's a huge legal challenge underway asking a very basic question: does the president even have the legal authority to do all this? Back on May 28th, a court actually ruled against the administration. Now, that ruling was immediately put on hold, but just last month, on July 31st, the Federal Circuit heard the oral arguments. So right now, the entire legal foundation of this policy is basically hanging in the balance. And you have to remember, at the very center of this whole political and legal fight, there's a really powerful reason to keep things just as they are. Remember that number? Over $150 billion in new government revenue, just this year. That is a ton of money, and it makes the idea of reversing course for any administration incredibly difficult. So where does that leave us? Are we watching a bold, maybe even necessary strategy to rebuild a stronger, more self-reliant American economy? Or are we just paying the ticket price for a global trade war, with the bill ultimately landing on all of us? That is the multi-billion-dollar question, and the answer is going to shape our economy for years to come. Thanks for joining us.